Sometimes the most unexpected people carry the heaviest stories. In a world where we judge others by their appearance, their clothes, or the way they speak, we often forget that true strength doesn't always announce itself with a loud voice or aggressive posture. Sarah Mitchell learned this lesson in the most powerful way possible when she walked into Murphy's Diner on a rainy Tuesday evening in October 2019. What started as a simple stop for coffee after her shift at the local hospital would become a moment that changed not just her own perspective, but the lives of everyone in that small-town restaurant. The woman who seemed like an easy target to a group of rowdy bikers would soon reveal a truth so profound that it would silence the entire room and leave grown men with tears in their eyes. This is the story of how a small tattoo on a quiet woman's wrist became a window into sacrifice, honor, and the unbreakable bond between those who serve. It's a reminder that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the most ordinary places. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy glass door of Murphy's Diner, the familiar chime announcing her arrival to the nearly empty restaurant. At 28, she had the kind of understated presence that allowed her to blend into crowds without effort. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her scrubs, still bearing the faint antiseptic smell of the hospital where she worked as a nurse, were wrinkled from a 12-hour shift that had tested every ounce of her patience and energy. The October rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the small town of Millbrook into a gray, soggy reflection of itself. Sarah had originally planned to drive straight home to her modest apartment, heat up a frozen dinner, and lose herself in a book until sleep claimed her. But her gas tank was nearly empty, and Murphy's Diner sat conveniently next to the only gas station still open after 9 p.m. in their quiet corner of Pennsylvania. The diner itself was a relic from the 1960s, all red vinyl booths and checkered floors that had seen better decades. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made even the healthiest person look slightly ill. Sarah had been coming here since she was a teenager, first with her parents after church on Sundays, later with friends during high school, and now occasionally when her demanding schedule at the hospital left her too tired to cook. Behind the counter, Martha Hendricks looked up from the crossword puzzle she'd been working on. Martha had owned Murphy's for 15 years, ever since her husband died, and left her with more bills than savings. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and hands that told the story of decades spent serving others. Her face lit up when she recognized Sarah, one of the few customers who always said please and thank you, who never complained about the coffee being too strong or the pie being too sweet. "Evening, honey," Martha called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Long day at the hospital?" Sarah slid onto one of the stools at the counter, grateful to finally sit down. Her feet ached in a way that only nurses and waitresses truly understood. That deep, bone-tired sensation that came from spending hours on concrete floors in shoes that promised comfort but delivered only the illusion of it. "The longest," Sarah replied, accepting the steaming mug that Martha placed in front of her. "We had a multi-car accident come in around noon and it just snowballed from there. Sometimes I think the universe has a sense of humor about timing." Martha nodded knowingly. She'd heard similar stories from the handful of hospital workers who frequented her diner. In a town of 8,000 people, everyone knew everyone. And the local hospital was always short-staffed, always overwhelmed, always asking its employees to do more with less. "You eat anything today?" Martha asked, already knowing the answer from the hollow look in Sarah's eyes. Sarah considered lying, but Martha had a way of seeing through such deceptions. "A granola bar around 6 this morning and some crackers from the vending machine around 3. "That's not eating, that's surviving," Martha said, disappearing into the kitchen without another word. Sarah knew better than to protest. Martha had appointed herself as the unofficial mother figure to every overworked young person who wandered into her establishment, and arguing with her about food was like arguing with the rain about falling. The diner was unusually quiet for a Tuesday evening. Usually there would be at least a few regulars scattered throughout the booths, lingering over coffee and sharing gossip about who was dating whom and whose teenager had gotten into trouble over the weekend. But the rain had kept most people home, leaving Sarah and Martha in a comfortable bubble of solitude. That peace was shattered at exactly 9:37 p.m. when the door chimed again, this time admitting a group of 5 men whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the small restaurant. They were bikers, though not the stereotypical leather and chains variety that Hollywood loved to portray. These men were in their 40s and 50s, wearing expensive riding gear and boots that cost more than Sarah made in a week. Their motorcycles, visible through the rain-streaked windows, were pristine machines that gleamed even under the dim parking lot lights. The group was led by a man named Rick Kowalski, though Sarah wouldn't learn his name until later. Rick was the kind of man who had always gotten by on his size and his voice, standing 6'4" with the broad shoulders of someone who had spent years in construction before a back injury forced him into early retirement. His gray beard was meticulously groomed, and his riding jacket bore patches from motorcycle rallies across the country. He had the confident swagger of someone who had never been truly challenged, never been forced to question his own assumptions about strength and power. Behind Rick came his usual crew: Tommy, a wiry man with nervous energy who talked too much and laughed too loud; Dave, whose silence spoke to years of following rather than leading; Mike, who had never quite outgrown his high school bullying tendencies; and Jerry, who went along with whatever the group decided because belonging somewhere, even somewhere questionable, felt better than belonging nowhere at all. They chose the large corner booth, the one that gave them a view of both the entrance and the counter where Sarah sat. Their voices filled the small space immediately: loud conversations about their ride through the mountains, complaints about the rain, crude jokes that made Martha's mouth tighten into a thin line of disapproval. Sarah tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the warmth of her coffee mug and the plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that Martha had placed in front of her. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with loud, obnoxious groups was simply to avoid eye contact and mind her own business. In her experience as a nurse, she had encountered enough difficult personalities to know that engagement rarely improved the situation. But Rick Kowalski was not a man who liked being ignored, especially not by women. He had noticed Sarah the moment his group entered, had taken inventory of her appearance, her solitude, her obvious exhaustion. In his mind, she represented an easy target, someone he could use to entertain his friends and reinforce his own sense of dominance in the social hierarchy he had constructed around himself. "Hey, sweetheart!" Rick called out, his voice carrying easily across the small diner. "You look like you've had a rough day. Why don't you come over here and let us buy you a drink? We've got some stories that'll cheer you right up." Sarah continued eating, pretending not to hear him. She had dealt with countless drunk patients, belligerent family members, and aggressive visitors during her years at the hospital. The key was not to escalate, not to give them the reaction they were looking for. But Rick interpreted her silence as defiance, and defiance was something he had never tolerated well. His voice grew louder, more insistent. "I'm talking to you, honey. It's rude to ignore someone when they're being friendly." Martha appeared from behind the counter, her face flushed with anger. She had seen this scenario play out before, though never in her own establishment. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voices down. This is a family restaurant." Rick's laugh was harsh, filled with the kind of mean-spirited humor that bullies had perfected over centuries. "Family restaurant? Look around, lady. It's just us, you, and little Miss Antisocial over there. We're not bothering anybody. You're bothering me," Sarah said quietly, not turning around. "And you're bothering Martha. If you want to be loud, there are plenty of bars in town that would welcome that kind of behavior." The moment the words left her mouth, Sarah knew she had made a mistake. She had given Rick exactly what he wanted: a response, a challenge, a reason to escalate the situation. She could feel the shift in the room's energy, could practically hear the gears turning in Rick's head as he prepared his next move. Rick stood up slowly, his considerable height allowing him to loom over the small restaurant like a thundercloud. His friends remained seated, but Sarah could feel their attention focused on the confrontation like spotlights. "Well, well," Rick said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge. "Little Miss Nurse thinks she's tough. You know what I think? I think you spend all day taking orders from doctors and cleaning up messes, and now you want to come in here and act like you're in charge." He took a step toward the counter, his boots loud on the checkered floor. You want to know what real toughness looks like? Real toughness is getting on a bike and riding 800 miles through mountain passes. Real toughness is not hiding behind some uniform and pretending you're important. Sarah felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a familiar anger that she had learned to control over years of dealing with difficult people. She had been called worse things by better people. But something about Rick's particular brand of arrogance struck a nerve that she usually kept well protected. Martha stepped forward, her small frame no match for Rick's intimidating presence, but her courage undimmed by the size difference. That's enough. I want you and your friends to leave now. Rick turned his attention to Martha, his smile cold and predatory. Or what? You going to call the cops? By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. Besides, we haven't done anything wrong. We're just having a conversation with our new friend here. He gestured towards Sarah, who had finally turned around on her stool to face the confrontation directly. For the first time, Rick got a clear look at her face, and what he saw there surprised him. Instead of fear or intimidation, he found himself looking into eyes that held a steady, unblinking confidence that didn't match her quiet demeanor. You don't know anything about toughness, Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire diner. And you don't know anything about me. Rick's friends exchanged glances, sensing that the dynamic in the room was shifting in ways they didn't quite understand. Tommy, always the first to escalate any situation, decided to jump in. Oh, this is Rich, Tommy said, his nasally voice cutting through the tension. Little hospital princess thinks she's seen some action. What's the toughest thing you've ever done? Honey, give someone a shot? Hold their hand while they cried? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid. Sarah looked at Tommy, then at Rick, then at each of the men who had turned her quiet evening into a confrontation she never wanted to have. She could feel Martha's worried presence behind the counter, could sense the older woman's fear that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. For a moment, Sarah considered simply leaving. She could put money on the counter, walk out to her car, and drive home to the safety of her apartment. She could let these men have their moment of perceived victory. Let them tell themselves whatever stories they needed to tell about putting an uppity woman in her place. But as she looked at Rick's smug face, at the anticipation in his friend's eyes, at Martha's fear and frustration, Sarah made a different choice. She slowly rolled up the sleeve of her scrubs, revealing her left forearm and the small, precise tattoo that she usually kept hidden beneath long sleeves and professional clothing. The tattoo was simple, just a few lines of black ink that formed a symbol most people wouldn't recognize. But Rick Kowalski recognized it immediately, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow. His confident smirk faltered, then disappeared entirely, replaced by an expression of shock that quickly transformed into something approaching shame. The symbol was the emblem of the United States Marine Corps, but not just any Marine Corps tattoo. The small addition beneath the eagle, globe, and anchor told a story that made Rick's stomach turn and his throat go dry. It was the symbol worn by those who had served in the most dangerous, most classified, most heroic operations that the military had to offer. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet nurse who had seemed like such an easy target, was not just a veteran. She was a decorated Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, who had seen combat that Rick couldn't even imagine, who had saved lives under enemy fire and had earned commendations that she never talked about because true heroes rarely did. The silence in Murphy's diner stretched out like a held breath, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Rick's friends looked confused, unsure of what had just happened, but sensing that their evening of casual bullying had taken an unexpected turn. Rick himself seemed frozen in place, his brain struggling to reconcile the image he had created of Sarah with the reality that her simple tattoo had just revealed. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to identify the strong from the weak, the real from the fake, and he had gotten it spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. Sarah remained seated, her sleeve still rolled up, her expression unchanged. She hadn't said a word since revealing the tattoo, hadn't needed to. Sometimes the most powerful statements were made in silence, and the small symbol on her arm was speaking volumes that her voice never could. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. though in reality it lasted only about 30 seconds. Rick Kowalski stood frozen in the middle of Murphy's diner, his mind racing through memories of his own father, a Vietnam veteran who had never spoken much about his service, but had taught Rick enough about military symbols to recognize what he was looking at. The small tattoo on Sarah's wrist wasn't just ink and pride, it was a mark that spoke to experiences Rick couldn't even begin to comprehend. Tommy, still oblivious to the shift in the room's energy, decided to double down on his earlier mockery. What's that supposed to be? Some kind of fake tough girl tattoo? You get that at some strip mall parlor to impress people? The words left his mouth before Rick could stop him, and the moment they did, Rick closed his eyes in genuine pain. He knew what was coming next, and he knew that his friend had just crossed a line that would change everything about this encounter. Sarah turned her attention to Tommy, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that seasoned soldiers wore when civilians talked about things they couldn't possibly understand. "This tattoo," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that none of the men had heard before, "represents 8 years of active duty in the United States Marine Corps, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. It represents nights spent in foxholes under enemy fire, watching for snipers who wanted nothing more than to put a bullet through my head. It represents holding my best friend Maria Santos in my arms while she bled out from an IED explosion that was meant for me." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Martha had moved closer to the counter, her earlier fear replaced by a growing sense of pride and protectiveness for the young woman she had known for years but never really understood. "It represents the Bronze Star I earned for pulling 2 wounded Marines out of a burning vehicle while insurgents fired at us from 3 different directions," Sarah continued, her voice never rising above conversational level but somehow filling the entire space. "It represents the Purple Heart I received when shrapnel from a mortar round tore through my shoulder and left me unconscious for 3 days in a field hospital in Kandahar." Tommy's face had gone pale, his earlier bravado evaporating like steam. He looked to Rick for support, but Rick was staring at Sarah with an expression that mixed horror, shame, and dawning respect in equal measures. "Most of all," Sarah said, slowly rolling her sleeve back down, "it represents the 23 men and women I couldn't save, the ones who died despite everything I tried to do for them, the ones whose faces I see every night when I close my eyes, whose families I wrote letters to explaining how their children died serving a country that half the time doesn't seem to remember they exist." She picked up her coffee mug and took a slow sip, her hands perfectly steady, despite the emotional weight of what she had just shared. When she looked back at the group of bikers, her expression had returned to the same calm neutrality she had worn when they first entered. "So when you ask me about toughness," she said, "when you question whether I know what real strength looks like, you need to understand that I've seen more genuine courage in a single day than most people witness in their entire lives, and it rarely comes from the people who are loudest about it." Rick felt his legs go weak, and he found himself sinking back into the booth without consciously deciding to sit down. His friends followed suit, the fight completely gone out of all of them. The woman they had chosen to mock and intimidate had just revealed herself to be someone who had literally risked her life for their freedom, someone who had sacrificed years of her youth in service to others. Dave, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, was the first to find his voice. "Ma'am," he said, his tone completely different from the casual arrogance the group had displayed earlier, "I want to apologize. We had no right to bother you, and we certainly had no right to question your service." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond directly. She had learned during her military service that some apologies were genuine expressions of remorse, while others were simply attempts to avoid consequences. Time would tell which category this one fell into. Martha, meanwhile, had moved around the counter and was now standing beside Sarah's stool like a protective guardian. Her earlier fear had transformed into something fiercer, a mama bear instinct that had been awakened by seeing someone she cared about being mistreated. "I think you gentlemen should probably head on home," Martha said, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Sarah's had a long day at work, and she doesn't need to deal with your foolishness on top of everything else." Rick looked up at Martha, then at Sarah, then down at his hands. He was a man who prided himself on never backing down from a confrontation, but this wasn't a confrontation anymore. This was a reckoning with his own assumptions and prejudices, and he found himself completely unprepared for the emotional complexity of the situation. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said, using Martha's formal name for the first time since entering the diner. "You're right. We should go. But first, I need to say something." He stood up slowly, his earlier aggressive posture replaced by something more subdued, more respectful. When he spoke, his voice lacked the booming confidence it had carried before. "Miss, I don't know your name, and maybe that's part of the problem. We came in here and saw someone we thought we could push around, someone we could use to make ourselves feel bigger and more important. We didn't see a person with her own story, her own experiences, her own sacrifices." Sarah turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. Rick found himself struggling to maintain eye contact with someone he had underestimated so completely. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend that saying sorry fixes what we did," Rick continued. "But I want you to know that my father served in Vietnam, and he taught me better than how we acted tonight. He would be ashamed of me right now, and he'd be right to be." For the first time since rolling up her sleeve, Sarah's expression softened slightly. She had seen this moment before, in various forms and contexts. It was the moment when someone's worldview shifted, when their assumptions crumbled in the face of uncomfortable truth. "Your father sounds like a good man," she said quietly. "The fact that you're thinking about what he would say means something." Rick nodded, blinking back tears that surprised him with their sudden appearance. He wasn't a man who cried often, but something about the evening had cracked open a part of him that he usually kept carefully locked away. "He was," Rick said. "He died 2 years ago, cancer from Agent Orange exposure. Toward the end, when the pain was really bad, he told me stories about his service that he'd never shared before. About the friends he lost, about the things he had to do, about coming home to people who either ignored him or treated him like some kind of monster." Sarah's expression grew even softer, recognition flickering in her eyes. She knew that story in all its variations, had lived through her own version of it, when she returned from her deployments to a country that seemed more interested in forgetting about the wars than honoring those who fought them. "The transition is hard," she said. "Coming back to a world where people worry about traffic jams and coffee being too cold when you've seen what we've seen. It changes you in ways that are difficult to explain to people who haven't been there." Martha listened to this exchange with growing understanding. She had always wondered about Sarah's occasional distant looks, her reluctance to talk about her past, her uncanny ability to remain calm in crisis situations that sent other people into panic. Now, suddenly, so many pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was working on clicked into place. Tommy, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. His usual talkativeness had abandoned him completely, leaving him staring at his hands and wondering how he had misread the situation so badly. Mike and Jerry were equally subdued, the reality of their behavior settling over them like a heavy weight. "I work at the VA hospital 2 days a week," Sarah continued, addressing Rick directly. "Volunteer work, mostly in the PTSD wing. I see guys like your father all the time, dealing with things that happened decades ago but feel like they happened yesterday. If you ever want to talk to someone who understands what he went through, the offer is there." Rick felt his throat close up entirely. The woman he had tried to humiliate was now offering to help him process his grief and his father's legacy. The generosity of the gesture, especially after his behavior, hit him harder than any physical blow could have. "Why?" he managed to ask. "After what we did, why would you offer to help?" Sarah considered the question seriously, taking another sip of her coffee while she formulated her response. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of years of experience and reflection. "Because that's what we do," she said. "Marines, soldiers, all of us who served. We look out for each other and for the families of those who served. It doesn't matter if you were rude to me in a diner. What matters is that your father earned respect through his service, and that respect extends to his family." She paused, looking around at all 5 men who sat in various states of shame and contemplation. "Besides," she added, "everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment. Tonight was your worst moment, but it doesn't have to define who you are going forward." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence felt different. Instead of tension and confrontation, there was something approaching understanding, maybe even the beginning of respect. The rain continued to fall against the windows, but inside Murphy's diner, something had fundamentally shifted. Rick reached into his wallet and pulled out 2 $20 bills, placing them on the table next to the coffee cups his group hadn't touched. "For our table and hers," he said to Martha. "And for the trouble we caused." Martha looked at the money, then at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "That's not necessary," Martha said, but Rick shook his head. "It is necessary," he replied. "It's the least we can do." He turned back to Sarah one more time. "If you meant what you said about the VA hospital, I might take you up on that offer. I've been carrying some things around since Dad died, and I don't think I'm handling them very well on my own." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Rick. "That's my cell number. Call anytime." "And Rick, the fact that you're willing to look at yourself honestly and try to do better already puts you ahead of a lot of people." Rick took the card with hands that shook slightly, folding it carefully and placing it in his wallet, next to a picture of his father in uniform. His friends had already stood up and were moving toward the door, their earlier swagger completely absent. As they prepared to leave, Tommy stopped and turned back toward Sarah. His face was red with shame, but he forced himself to speak. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm really, really sorry. My nephew is in the Army, deployed overseas right now, and I'm terrified every day that I'm going to get a phone call saying something happened to him. What I said to you tonight was unforgivable." Sarah looked at Tommy for a long moment, seeing past his earlier obnoxiousness to the fear and pain underneath. "What's your nephew's name?" she asked. "Marcus. Marcus Thompson. He's a medic with the 82nd Airborne." Sarah smiled, and this time it was genuine and warm. "Marcus is lucky to have family who worry about him. That love and support from home means more than you know when you're deployed. Make sure he knows how much you care about him." Tommy nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "I will, and thank you for everything you've done and for being better to us than we deserve tonight." As the 5 men filed out of the diner, the atmosphere began to return to something approaching normal. Martha immediately moved to Sarah's side, her maternal instincts in full force. "Honey, are you okay? That must have been hard talking about all of that." Sarah finished her coffee and pushed the empty mug across the counter. "Actually, it felt good. I don't talk about my service very often, and maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe if more people understood what veterans go through, situations like tonight wouldn't happen as often." Martha refilled the mug without being asked, her movements automatic and comforting. "I had no idea you were a Marine. You never mentioned it." "Most people don't know how to respond to it," Sarah explained. "They either treat you like some kind of hero, which makes me uncomfortable, or they treat you like you're damaged goods, which makes me angry. It's easier to just let people assume I've always been a nurse." She looked out the window at the 5 motorcycles pulling out of the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the rain. "But maybe that's doing everyone a disservice. Maybe we need more honest conversations about what military service really means, what it costs, what it gives back." That Rick fellow seemed genuinely sorry by the end. "Think he'll actually call you about the VA thing?" Sarah shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But the offer was real, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just knowing that someone understands, that someone is willing to listen, can make all the difference." She stood up from the stool, her shift finally feeling like it was truly over. The confrontation had drained her emotionally, but it had also reminded her of something important about herself, something she sometimes forgot in the routine of her civilian life. She was a Marine. She always would be. And that meant something, whether she talked about it or not. 3 weeks later, Sarah was finishing her morning rounds at Millbrook General Hospital when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another spam message about extended car warranties or miracle weight loss solutions. But something made her glance at the screen. "This is Rick from Murphy's Diner. I've been thinking about what you said about the VA hospital. Would you have time to talk sometime this week?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, surprised by the mixture of emotions it stirred up. She had offered her help that rainy night 3 weeks ago, but she hadn't really expected Rick to follow through. In her experience, people often made promises in moments of high emotion that they later forgot or chose to ignore when the intensity of the situation faded. She typed back quickly. Of course. I'm at the VA on Thursday afternoons. We could meet there around 3 if that works for you. The response came back almost immediately. Thank you. I'll see you then. Sarah slipped her phone back into her pocket and continued with her rounds, but her mind kept drifting back to that night at Murphy's diner. The confrontation had affected her more than she had initially realized. For years, she had kept her military service compartmentalized, treating it as a chapter of her life that was closed and separate from her civilian identity. But something about being forced to defend and explain her experiences had awakened a part of herself that she had been keeping dormant. That evening, after her shift ended, Sarah found herself driving not toward her apartment, but toward the small Veterans Hall on the outskirts of town. She hadn't been there in over a year, not since the last time she had attended one of their monthly meetings. The building was modest, a single-story structure with a faded American flag hanging from a pole in the parking lot, but it represented something important, a place where people who had shared similar experiences could gather without having to explain themselves. Inside, she found exactly what she expected. A dozen or so veterans of various ages, sitting in a circle of folding chairs talking about everything and nothing in the way that only people who had served together could. There was Jim Peterson, who had lost his left leg to an IED in Iraq and now worked as a counselor for disabled veterans. There was Maria Gonzalez, an Air Force veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and now taught high school mathematics. There was old Walter Kowalski, who had served in Korea and never talked much about it but showed up faithfully every month just to be around people who understood. The mention of the name Kowalski made Sarah do a double take. She approached Walter after the meeting, introducing herself and explaining about her encounter with Rick at the diner. Walter's weathered face broke into a slow smile. Rick's my grandson, he said. Lost his father, my son Tommy, when Rick was just a baby. I tried to raise that boy right, but he's always been a little too quick to use his size to solve problems. He mentioned his father served in Vietnam, Sarah said carefully, not wanting to betray any confidences. My son Tommy served 2 tours, Walter confirmed. Came back different, like most of us did. Struggled with drinking for a while, had a hard time holding down jobs. But he straightened himself out eventually. Married a good woman. Had Rick. Died when Rick was 3 years old in a car accident. The pieces of Rick's story began to fall into place for Sarah. A boy raised by a grandfather who had his own military trauma, growing up without a father figure, learning to navigate the world through physical presence rather than emotional intelligence. Rick called me about coming to the VA, Sarah said. I think he's carrying some heavy things around. Walter nodded knowingly. He's been different since I died. More angry, more likely to pick fights. I keep telling him that anger is just grief wearing a disguise, but young men don't always listen to old grandfathers. Would you be willing to come with him on Thursday? Sarah asked. Sometimes these conversations are easier when family is involved. I'd be honored to. Rick's a good boy underneath all that bluster. He just needs to find his way back to who he really is. Afternoon came quickly, and Sarah found herself unusually nervous as she waited in the VA hospital lobby. She had conducted countless counseling sessions with veterans and their families, but something about this particular meeting felt more personal, more invested with meaning beyond the usual professional interaction. Rick arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt instead of his usual biker gear. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing without the leather jacket and the swagger. Behind him walked an elderly man whom Sarah immediately recognized as Walter from the Veterans Hall. Sarah Mitchell, she said, extending her hand to Rick and then to Walter. Mr. Kowalski, it's good to see you again. Walter's eyes twinkled with amusement. You two know each other already? This town gets smaller every day. They found a quiet conference room on the 2nd floor, away from the bustle of the main hospital corridors. Sarah had learned over the years that these conversations needed space to breathe, needed an environment where people could speak honestly without worrying about being overheard or judged. Rick seemed unsure of how to begin, his earlier confidence completely absent. Sarah waited patiently, having learned that silence was often the most powerful tool in helping people find their words. "I've been thinking about that night at the diner," Rick finally said. "About the things you said, about your service, about the people you lost. It made me realize that I don't know much about my own father's experience, even though I've spent my whole life being affected by it." Walter reached over and placed a weathered hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Your father was a complicated man, Rick. The war changed him, like it changed all of us. But that doesn't mean he didn't love you, and it doesn't mean his struggles were your fault." Over the next hour, a story emerged that Sarah had heard in various forms dozens of times before. A young man sent to fight in a war he didn't understand, coming home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge what he had been through. Walter talked about his son Tommy's nightmares, his drinking, his difficulty maintaining relationships, his eventual death in a car accident that may or may not have been entirely accidental. Rick talked about growing up feeling responsible for his father's pain, about learning to use his physical size to protect himself and others, about never quite knowing how to process emotions that seemed too big and too complicated for words. "The thing that gets me," Rick said, his voice breaking slightly, "is that I've spent years talking about toughness and strength, but I never understood what real strength looked like until I saw it in you that night. My father was probably dealing with things I can't even imagine, and instead of trying to understand him, I just got angry that he wasn't there." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "Survivor's guilt is real, Rick, and it doesn't just affect the people who served. It affects their families, too. You've been carrying your father's pain without even realizing it, and that's not sustainable." They talked for another hour about coping mechanisms, about the difference between healthy and unhealthy ways of processing grief, about the resources available for family members of veterans. Walter shared stories about his own struggles after Korea, about the decades it took him to understand that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. As the meeting wound down, Rick looked directly at Sarah for the first time since they had sat down. "I want to do something," he said. "I want to find a way to honor veterans like my father, like you, like Grandpa Walter. I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I have an idea." Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious about what he might have in mind. "I want to organize a ride," Rick continued, his enthusiasm growing as he spoke. "Not just my regular group, but bikers from all over the region. A memorial ride to raise money for the VA hospital, maybe ending here with a ceremony to honor local veterans." Walter's face broke into a wide smile. Tommy would have liked that. He always said motorcycles were the one thing that made him feel free after he came back. Sarah found herself smiling too, impressed by the thoughtfulness of Rick's proposal. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. The VA could definitely use the support, and public recognition of veteran service is always meaningful. Would you help me plan it?" Rick asked. "I know I don't have the right to ask after how I treated you, but I think it would mean more if someone like you was involved." Sarah considered the request carefully. She had spent years keeping her military service private, avoiding situations that might thrust her into the spotlight. But something about Rick's genuine desire to honor veterans, to turn his own painful realization into something positive, appealed to her. "I'll help," she said, "but I have one condition. This can't be about me or my service. It needs to be about all veterans, especially the ones who are struggling, the ones who don't get recognition, the ones who are fighting battles that nobody sees." Rick nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. That's exactly what I want." Over the following months, what started as a simple idea grew into something much larger and more meaningful. Rick reached out to motorcycle groups across Pennsylvania and the surrounding states, many of whom had their own veterans among their members. Word spread through social media, through veterans organizations, through the informal networks that connect people who have served their country. The Millbrook Memorial Ride was scheduled for the first Saturday in May, with participants gathering at sunrise for a breakfast at Murphy's Diner, before embarking on a scenic route through the Pennsylvania mountains, ending at the VA hospital for a ceremony honoring local veterans. Martha Hendricks donated the breakfast, refusing to accept payment for feeding the hundreds of bikers who showed up that morning. Local businesses contributed prizes for a raffle, with all proceeds going to support veterans programs. The mayor declared it an official town event, and the local newspaper ran feature stories about the participating veterans and their experiences. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came not during the official ceremony, but in a quiet moment before the ride began. She was standing in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, watching the sea of motorcycles and leather-clad riders, when she noticed a young woman standing alone by her bike, looking nervous and out of place. Sarah approached her, recognizing something familiar in the woman's posture and expression. "First ride?" she asked. The young woman nodded. "I'm Jennifer. I just got back from Afghanistan 6 months ago. I heard about this ride and thought I should come, but I don't really know anyone here." Sarah smiled, remembering her own early struggles with civilian social situations after her deployment. "I'm Sarah. Afghanistan as well, but a few years ago. Want to ride with our group? We'll make sure you're not alone." Jennifer's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "That would be amazing. Thank you." As they prepared to mount their bikes, Jennifer asked, "What made you decide to come today? You don't seem like the typical biker rally type." Sarah looked around at the crowd of riders, at Rick and his friends helping to organize the departure, at Walter Kowalski proudly wearing his Korean War veteran's hat, at Martha Hendricks waving from the diner window. "Sometimes," Sarah said, "you don't realize how much you need community until you find it. And sometimes that community comes from the most unexpected places." The ride itself was spectacular. Hundreds of motorcycles winding through mountain roads under a brilliant spring sky, stopping at scenic overlooks for photos and brief ceremonies honoring fallen comrades. At the VA hospital, local veterans shared their stories. Families of the deceased were honored, and everyone present was reminded that freedom is not free, and that those who serve deserve respect and support long after their active duty ends. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the day was not captured in any newspaper photo or official program. It was the moment when Rick Kowalski stood before the assembled crowd and spoke, not about himself or his own journey, but about his father, his grandfather, and all the veterans whose sacrifices had made the day possible. "6 months ago," Rick said, his voice carrying clearly through the hospital parking lot, "I thought I understood what toughness meant. I thought it was about being the loudest person in the room, about never backing down from a fight, about using your size to get what you want. But I was wrong about all of that." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him, many of them veterans who had made sacrifices he was only beginning to understand. Real toughness is serving your country when it's dangerous and difficult. Real toughness is coming home and building a life after seeing things that would break most people. Real toughness is admitting when you're wrong, asking for help when you need it, and finding ways to honor those who came before you. He gestured towards Sarah, who was standing with Jennifer and several other veterans near the front of the crowd. Real toughness is a nurse named Sarah Mitchell, who served 3 tours in combat zones, and now volunteers her time to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. Real toughness is my grandfather, Walter Kowalski, who served in Korea and spent 60 years carrying those experiences while raising a family and building a community. Rick's voice broke slightly as he continued. "Real toughness is my father, Tommy Kowalski, who gave everything he had to serve his country, and struggled with the cost of that service for the rest of his life. He died too young, but his sacrifice meant something, and I want to make sure nobody forgets that." The crowd was completely silent, moved by the raw honesty of Rick's words. When he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, but more meaningful than the sound was the sense of connection and understanding that had been created among all the people present. Later that evening, after the ceremonies had ended and most of the participants had departed, Sarah found herself back at Murphy's Diner with Rick, Walter, Martha, and Jennifer. They sat in the same booth where the confrontation had occurred months earlier, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. "You know," Martha said, refilling coffee cups around the table, "this might be the best thing that's ever happened in Millbrook. Not just the ride, but everything that led up to it. Sometimes it takes a difficult moment to show us who we really are and who we want to become." Rick nodded, looking directly at Sarah. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to show me that tattoo, to tell me about your service. I probably would have gone on thinking I was tough while never understanding what real courage looks like." Sarah smiled, feeling more at peace with her own story than she had in years. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow, Rick. The fact that you were willing to look at yourself honestly and change shows real character." Jennifer, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "This whole day has been incredible. I've been struggling since I got back, feeling like nobody understands what I went through over there. But meeting all of you, hearing these stories, being part of this community, it's the first time since my deployment that I felt like I belong somewhere."
Walter raised his coffee mug in a toast.
"To second chances," he said. "To the courage to change, the wisdom to listen, and the strength to help each other heal." As they clinked their mugs together in the fluorescent light of Murphy's diner, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. A simple confrontation over coffee had evolved into something much larger, a community, a memorial, a chance for healing and understanding. She thought about the Marines she had served with, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't, and she realized that this was exactly what they had been fighting for all along. Not just the abstract concept of freedom, but the concrete reality of people coming together, supporting each other, and creating meaning out of shared experience. The rain that had been falling that first night had long since stopped, but the seeds planted during that difficult conversation continued to grow, spreading outward in ripples of understanding, compassion, and genuine human connection. And in a small diner in Pennsylvania, a group of unlikely friends had learned that sometimes the most powerful revelations come not from the stories we tell about ourselves, but from the courage to let others see who we really are beneath the surface.